Hi everyone, this is Rosie, and today we will be sewing a composition notebook cover. So let's get started. Here's an example of the cover that we will be making. It does fit a standard size composition notebook, which I'll talk about in a minute. It has an elastic closure, which is optional. You do not have to include that if you don't want to, and it also has an optional pen loop. You'll see right here it has these beautifully rounded corners that fit the contour of the book, and I'll show you how to achieve those corners in the video. I used a contrasting fabric for the binding, and then I also have my front and back cover pieces. On the inside, you're going to see a very plain interior. It just has the sleeves for slipping in the notebook cover. And then you'll see the same sleeve on the opposite back cover. Now let's talk about the notebooks that I used for the cover. I have two composition notebooks right here, and they are standard size notebooks that measure 9 3/4 inches high by 7.5 inches wide. The difference between the two books is the thickness. This one has 100 pages and this one has 120 pages. So you can see by looking this way, the one here that I'm holding in the front is not as wide as the one in the back. But the book that we're going to make today will accommodate both sizes. And I have this notebook cover right here. This one is used in the smaller book, or the book that's less wide, with 100 pages, and you can see it still is a very nice fit. And this one here that I've already showed you is in the book that has more pages. And you can see that it's a nice fit on either notebook. Now when you're making these, you'll need either 2 or 3 fabrics, and I am using 100% cotton quilting fabric. All the fabrics are interfaced with a woven interfacing such as SF101. On this one here, I've used 2 fabrics. So if I open it up and we look at the exterior, you're going to see I have one fabric here for the binding and a second fabric for my front and back covers. Then on the inside, I've used the same fabric that I used for the binding for my sleeves, and then I have the fabric here for my lining, which is the same as the front and back covers. Then on this one, I used 3 separate fabrics, and again, they're 100% cotton quilting fabrics. I have my binding fabric here, plus my front and back covers. And then on the inside, I used the same fabric for my sleeves that I used for the binding, and then I used a separate fabric for my lining. Let's go over the materials that you will need to make your notebook cover. I am using 100% cotton quilting fabric for the entire project. If you would like to use 3 different fabrics for your cover, then you will need 1/3 of a yard of fabric for the exterior front and back covers. You'll need another 1/3 of a yard of fabric for your binding and your sleeves, and then you'll need 1/3 of a yard of fabric for your lining. If you decide that you only want to use 2 fabrics for your project, then you will need 1/3 of a yard that will be used for your front and back exterior covers, and this fabric will also be used for your lining. And 1/3 of a yard of fabric will be enough for that. And then you will need 1/3 of a yard of fabric for the binding and the sleeves. You will also need 1 yard of Pellon SF101 woven interfacing, and the 1 yard is enough whether you're using all 3 fabrics in your project or just 2 fabrics in your project. For the elastic closure and pen holder, you will need 15 inches of elastic, and I am using fold over elastic for that. You will need some all-purpose sewing thread, and I like to use Wonder Clips, but you can use some straight pins for holding your project together if you prefer. Then you will need a hand sewing needle, which I have right here, a pair of scissors, a point turner. You'll need a rotary cutter along with a rotary cutting mat and ruler, and you will also want to have a seam ripper on hand. Now let's go ahead and look at the pieces that you will need to cut out. First, you're going to need a piece of fabric for the binding area. It's 100% cotton quilting fabric, and it has been interfaced with a woven interfacing. This piece here needs to be cut 4 1/2 inches wide by 10 3/4 inches high. And all the pieces that I'm going to show you now have been interfaced with the woven interfacing. Then you need 2 pieces for your sleeves, and these pieces need to be cut 7 inches wide by 10 3/4 inches high. For your front and back covers, you need to cut out 2 pieces that are 6 3/8 inches wide by 10 3/4 inches high. And then for your lining, you'll need 1 piece that is cut out 16.25 inches wide by 10 3/4 inches high. Now we can go ahead and start sewing. The first step is to sew the front and back cover to the binding. Now the piece on this side here is for your front cover, and this piece over here is your back cover. Your front cover needs to be sewn to the right side of the binding, so if you have a piece that you want to feature for the front cover, it needs to be in this position here. Now you're going to take your pieces and you're going to place them right sides together. So the front cover will be right sides together with the binding. You want to line everything up so that your top and bottom edges are even and the length here is even with each other as well. So get those edges even and go ahead and put in a few clips. You can use pins here if you prefer. I like to use Wonder Clips. After that's clipped together, we can sew straight down the length with a 1/4 inch seam. After you sew your seam, you'll go ahead and clip the back cover to the binding right sides together, just the same way that you did for the front, making sure that those top and bottom edges and all along the length there are even with each other. And after everything is clipped in place, I'll move over to the sewing machine and we can sew these seams up. I'm ready to sew my front and back covers to the binding. I will be sewing on my Juki DX 4000 QVP, which is also known as the Kokochi. You want to keep a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and my stitch length is going to be 2.6. And make sure that you back stitch well at the beginning and the end of your seams. And as you're sewing along, just make sure that your edges are staying nice and even with each other. And after you finish sewing that first seam, you can go ahead and flip everything over and sew your second seam. I have my front and back covers sewn to both sides of the binding, and now all I want to do is iron those seams open. So go ahead and just give them a good pressing. And then I will also press it from the right side of the fabric. Then as long as you have your iron out right now, you want to go ahead and take the 2 pieces that will be the interior sleeves. You're going to fold them in half, make sure that all those edges are nice and even, and just press the sleeves in half. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and top stitch along that folded edge, perhaps about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch away from the folded edge. I do not do that. I don't really think it's needed, but if you would like to top stitch, you certainly can go ahead and do that. I've had people ask me about the mat that I'm ironing on right now. I use it sometimes in my videos, but not very often. But since people have asked, I will show you. This is from OmniGrid. It folds up, just as you see here. And on one side, there is an ironing mat. And on the other side, there's a cutting board. Now, OmniGrid does make these in a couple of sizes. I'm not sure how many, if it's 2 or 3, but this is the first one I ever owned. On this one, you do have a cutting area, but it's not gridded, and this side is for ironing, and my dogs thought it would be a good idea to chew this one up. So now that we have our front cover ironed, I'm going to go over the next step. You want to take it and place it wrong side up on your work surface. And the first thing that we want to do is mark a 3/8 of an inch sewing line all around the 4 sides. So just take your ruler and line it up and mark 3/8 of an inch away from the edge all around the entire cover. Now I am using a friction pen in this video, and I only use them for demonstration purposes because while the ink will disappear with heat, it can come back with cold. So always be careful when you're using one of these pens. And then you'll go ahead and continue marking all around the 4 sides. After marking the seam line on the 4 sides, I'm going to turn my cover this way. And then I want to go ahead and get my composition notebook. And I'm going to line up the top and side edges here along with that seam line. So just line it up, make sure that those edges on the notebook are sitting right on top of your seam lines that you drew in, and then you're going to take your marker and you're going to trace around that curve. You're going to do this in all 4 corners. So when we're sewing, we're actually going to follow this line, and it's going to help you get those nice rounded corners that I showed you in the beginning of the video. So go ahead and mark all 4 corners in exactly the same way. Now I'm ready to install my elastic, and the elastic is going to be installed on the back cover, which is right here. So I'm going to turn it this way, and I mostly just eyeball this. Now on the fold over elastic, there's a shiny side and a dull side. You want the shiny side to be facing down against the right side of the fabric. And I generally go in about 1.5 inches with my elastic. And again, you can just eyeball this, but you'll just line it up however far in you want it to go. And then you're just going to trim off the end. And the length of the elastic should be the same length of the book. So the height of the book was 10 3/4 inches. Your elastic will be 10 3/4 inches tall. And then I'll just hold it in place with a couple of clips, and then we're going to sew it down on the sewing machine. Then for the pen holder, what I like to do is take the fold over elastic, and now we're going to put the dull sides together. And then I like to take the pen that I'm going to use. I'm not going to give you a measurement for this because it really depends on the pen that you're using. And I'll slip the pen in between the elastic there, just like this. And then on the wrong side where I have those seam allowances, I want to place the pen right here up against that seam allowance to just get an idea of how deep that elastic needs to be. So I just kind of line it up there. When it looks like it's in a good position, then I just pin it in place. And then I'm going to clip off that excess. And now I'm ready to sew both the pen holder and the elastic closure in place. First, I'm sewing the elastic closure in place. I'm using a stitch length of 2.6, and I'm just going in about 1/4 of an inch from the edge there, and I will back stitch over this a few times. Then I'll flip it over and sew the other end in place. Now for the pen holder, I want to remove the elastic from the wrong side because it actually needs to be sewn to the right side of the back cover. The only reason why I had it positioned on the wrong side was so that I could see where the seam allowance was. Now you can place this wherever you want. You can eyeball it. You can place it about in the center. You can place it up a little higher. It's totally up to you. I'm going to place mine in the center, and then I am going to stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the edge here, and I will go over it a few times with a stitch length of 2.6. I'm ready to sew the first sleeve in place, and this sleeve is going to be sewn to the back cover. And we're going to do this in such a way that we will be creating an opening for turning the project right side out over here on this side, and that opening, once we sew it closed, is going to be completely hidden. So what we want to do now is clip everything together. Make sure your top and bottom edges are all even with each other, and go ahead and clip along the length here. This is a really nice method for hiding your opening that I've used a number of times. After the sleeve is clipped to the front cover, right sides together, we want to mark the area for our opening so that we can turn our project. So I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm going to put a mark here and one mark here. And now what we want to do is we want to sew between these marks. Now I know normally you would leave the area between the two marks open, and it's going to be clear to you when we put the lining on why we do this. But you want to start at this mark and sew using that seam line all the way down to your second mark. I'm ready to sew, and I'm using a stitch length of 2.6, and I'm going to sew right on top of that seam line that we marked. You do want to back stitch at both ends. So I started at that first mark, and I'm sewing down to the second mark that's right here. When I get to that mark, I will stop and back stitch. I finished stitching between the two marks for the opening, and now if I turn this right side up, you're going to see that there's a finished edge here. And now we want to go ahead and pin the other sleeve in place plus the lining. So here's my second sleeve. I'm going to clip it to the front cover. Again, always make sure that all of your edges are even with each other. And after I have that clipped in place, I'm going to take my lining and I'm going to place it right sides together with the front cover, and the sleeves will be sandwiched in between. So you'll line everything up and clip all around the entire cover. Make sure everything is laying nice and flat and that your edges are even. I have all the sections clipped together, and now we're ready to sew. We're going to start right where one of the marks for the opening is, and we're going to stitch all the way around. And then we're going to stop when we get to the second mark that we created for the opening. So we won't be sewing over the stitched area that we created before. And by not stitching over that area, it's going to leave an opening right here. And that's the opening that we will use to turn the project right side out. I'm ready to start stitching. I will use a stitch length of 2.6, and we want to follow the seam line that we drew in at the beginning of the video. Now, when I start, I will be starting on this line of stitching right here. This is the line of stitching when we sewed the sleeve to the back cover. I just want to overlap that by just a little bit. So I'm going to place my needle down into the fabric right at the bottom of that stitching line. And then I'll start sewing by back stitching. And then you're going to follow this all around. Now when you get to where the curve is, you're going to go very slowly, and if you need to pivot, you just take one stitch at a time and you pivot. And this is going to give you a very neat rounded corner. And then you'll just continue sewing all around the cover in the same manner. When you get back to that last corner, you're going to sew around just like you did before. Stay on that line the best that you can. And now we're back to the second mark that we created for the opening, and I'm going to stitch, and I'm going to go a few stitches past where that stitching line ends, and then we'll back stitch. And now you can see where the opening is right here for turning. And because we sewed that sleeve to the front of the cover, you're going to have a nice clean edge here when this is turned right side out. And you will never see that hand stitching because the hand stitching will be hidden underneath the sleeve. Now we want to iron all of the seams open flat. So you'll just press all the way around here. After you iron the seams on this side, go ahead and flip it over, and we want to do the same thing from the lining side. Over here where the opening is, you want to fold that back by the 3/8 inch seam allowance and press. And then you can go ahead and press the rest of those seams open. After everything is pressed, we want to go ahead and trim around the curve of those corners. And I go pretty close. I don't worry about the material fraying because it has been interfaced with the woven interfacing, so those corners should not fray. And you will trim all 4 corners, just like this. When you get to where the opening is, you don't want to trim back any of the seam allowance. You want to make sure that it stays at the full 3/8 inch seam allowance. And after you have those corners trimmed, then you can go ahead and reach into your opening and start turning your project right side out. And I like to get into each one of those rounded corners with my finger and just push out those corners. After you have it all turned, your sleeves will be on the exterior of the cover, and that's fine. That's exactly where you want it to be right now. You can also go ahead and take your point turner and just very gently push out those corners. You do not want to poke through your stitching, so just do it very gently on all 4 corners. And then after you do that, I like to just give this a pressing first. So what you want to do is roll the seam so that the seam there is laying right on the top. And then go ahead and press. And then I do the same thing on the sides where the sleeves are. And then I press. Now over on this side, where we have the opening, I'm going to fold back this edge right here on the sleeve, right along that stitching line, and you're going to press there as well. I'll briefly demo how I stitch this closed, and just so you know, I'm not the best hand stitcher in the world. So I just take my needle and thread and I put it through the sleeve first, and then I just want to take a small stitch from each side. So here's a small stitch on the lining side, and then a small stitch on the sleeve side. And then I just keep stitching in that manner all the way across until I get to the end, and then I will just close everything up with a knot. And this really does need to be done with hand stitching. You cannot stitch this kind of closure up on the machine. So just keep going along until you get to the end. And one other thing is, when I take my stitch on the sleeve side, so right here, I try and put my needle in right where that machine stitching is. You don't want to go beyond it. Now that I've stitched all the way across, when I get to the end, I will just knot it up by forming a little loop right there, and then I put the needle through the loop and pull. And I'll do that maybe 2 or 3 times. And then I take my needle and then I'll just bury it for a little ways into the lining and pull it through, and then I'll cut the thread off right there where the thread is coming out through the lining. So that's it. I don't do the best job, and that's why I always like to try and find a way to hide my opening. Now that I've sewn up my opening, I can go ahead and I want to flip the sleeves to the lining side. And then I'll once again take my point turner and just gently poke those corners out. You can see they're nice and round. And then I'm going to give this one last good pressing all the way around. Here's our book cover all completed. And if we look at this end here, that closure is completely hidden. The only thing left for us to do is put in our notebook. Well, I do hope that you've enjoyed watching this tutorial. I have to tell you, I'm a little bit addicted to this project. I've made so many of them already. I hope that you'll give it a try. And I want to thank everyone who is supporting me by liking my videos and subscribing to my channel. If you're not already a subscriber, I would love to have you as one, so please like and subscribe. I'd also like to see you over at my Facebook group, which is Rosie and David Patterns, where you can post pictures of your Rosie and David makes and ask as many questions as you need. Thanks for watching.